You're listening to The Justin Herman Show, where every episode he has conversations with interesting people. Here is your host, Justin Herman.
Well, hey, how's it going?
I'm pretty good. I mean, perpetually tired, but that's the life of a parent, right?
It is. It is. We were just chatting before we got started that I love the activeness of kids, whether it be in the background of podcasts, which your kid might be in the background of this one, or at church. We were talking about that a little bit, and it's so funny. My opinions on this definitely shifted when I started having kids. When I was a young person, I don't think I realized how important this stuff was.
Yeah, and what's funny is there's a little bit of a gap, actually a 4-year gap between our oldest and our middle, and then our niece briefly lived with us for like a year, so we jumped from 2 to 3, and then sadly she's not living with us anymore, and then we had our third, and we've just always been a girl house, and from ages like 9 to newborn, and it's funny how I think that even single people aren't as anti-kids as us married people with kids make them out to be.
Yeah.
Because when we had this horde of little girls who are mostly well behaved, but hey, they're still little kids, right?
Yeah.
We would ask people, we'd get invited to dinner parties or events and stuff like that, and we'd be like, okay, well, we can come, but only if we can bring our kids. And we were pleasantly surprised at the people that were like, oh my gosh, yes, please, I love kids, or like, oh yeah, sure, I didn't even think of that, go ahead. And then I think that I would like to think that it inspired them to get married and have babies, because they saw that our life can be crazy and hectic and tiring, but children really do bring about so much joy. And you can kind of see, how people say that gender is a social construct, but in real life, you see examples of how it isn't.
Yeah.
It's God-given and innate all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of those examples is how we would be at these events or something, and all of the women would like gather around to like play with and watch the girls, because there's this like innate motherly kind of nurturing thing in women, right? That's different than men. And we like to say, we have lots of friends now that are married and working on their first kid or second kid, and they're like, oh, you guys inspired us to like have babies, or your kid made us want to have kids because they were just so cool. And we were like, score, it's a win. So I know that when you're single, you kind of think about things differently, but I do think that a lot of single people are more pro kid than we give them credit for.
So anyone who listens to the Daily Wire knows you and is familiar with you, and you've done a lot of other things before the Daily Wire. Here's my first thought: has your view on professionalism or career or ambition, has any of that shifted as you started or continued to have kids? Like, has it shifted over time?
Yeah, and I have to say, to be brutally honest, I never, 15 years ago when I entered the workplace, I was interning for Hannity Radio, and then he offered me a job as a producer. I kind of thought to myself like, oh, I'll wait till I'm like 29 or 30. I'll do a Christian dating app. I'll get married and have kids and be a stay-at-home mom. So I kind of always wanted to be married and have kids, and never anticipated that my career path would be me being the quote unquote talent or on-air personality. And now as I've done that, yeah, it's totally shifted my perspective, I think. And I was talking to somebody the other day, and I think a big part of what I do isn't just because I believe in the importance of politics and how it affects pop culture and religion and family and so much more, right? Mm-hmm. But I do what I do, and my husband thankfully is supportive of what I do for our girls, so they can have an example of, if they have a dream or they have a purpose or they have a vision for what they are passionate about or talented for, they don't need to limit it because of what other people do or say. And with that comes challenges, of course. Like, I missed a dance recital this week because I was speaking at the Michigan State. But I hope that, when I come home, my 6-year-old's like, what were you doing? And I can tell her, Mommy was giving a speech. And what about? And I say about the importance of babies, that's something that she'll remember one day and maybe aspire to do the same thing.
I feel so much of what I do as an adult now and as a dad now is for things just like that. Like the reasoning of, I want them to see dad so that they know that they can. And I have 2 boys, so for me it's really important. Not that I'm not pro holding doors open, but it's like I feel like will go to a degree over the top so they can see, hey boys, this is how mom should be treated. Like, we hold doors, like, hey, you hold the door, get help, because this is the kind of man you should be. And I feel like not everyone's like that, though. Like, sometimes, like, there's still like this high level of selfishness in what they do or people's motivations. Even sometimes, even as a parent, it's still about me and my career and what I'm trying to build. And so there's a lot of humility in what you said.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, like, I kind of pinch myself that people will show up to listen to me speak. Maybe I need to be a little more self-promoting and narcissistic in how I am or how I present myself, but I'm just not. And I just try to be like, this is why I'm doing this, for my beliefs and for my girls. And that's kind of where I am. And I really do hope that it does encourage and inspire other young people to make decisions and live their life in a righteous and like positive way. And so, yeah. And I think that example that you lead for your boys is so important. And even how your wife, interacts with them is what they're going to look to in a woman one day as well. I think one of the things that I really appreciate that my husband does, and our girls are so good, so it has very rarely happened, but he will lay down the hammer when necessary, is he'll be like, don't treat my wife that way. And so there's this element of, and like you saying that to your boys, like living out an example of like, this is how I treat mom, so this is how you should treat mom, right?
Yeah.
That there's this level of esteeming your spouse and respecting your spouse, so your kids see how you guys interact as a couple, and then that's how they then interact or respect or fear you, in a positive fear, not like a iron fist fear way of how then they go about looking for their spouse one day and their life partner.
You said you got your start on. Did you get your start on Hannity? You were doing the radio show and then moved to. So, describe that role? So, for someone who doesn't know the news, radio, TV, the industry at all, what's the role of a producer? Like, what would you do on a regular basis?
So for Sean's radio show, we always joke that we were leaner and meaner than TV, with all due respect to his hardworking Fox team. Radio was a separate company, and there were for the 20 some odd bookers and producers and camera guys and hair and makeup and all that stuff that's necessary for TV. We were a lean and mean team. So it was Sweet Baby James was his executive producer. It was me for a while as the associate producer and call screener is how I got my start, a senior producer and a board op. And so you really did do a lot of things. Sean did at the time, the Freedom concerts. So there was an element of helping, not like plan things, but you had to be good at executing last minute decision making and travel and logistics and just dealing with people from all different companies and kind of working cohesively together to make sure the show would go on.
Yeah.
And on a day-to-day basis, it was a lot of research and guest booking and pulling audio and determining what's happening in the news that day, and really breaking it down to who is the audience and what does the audience want to hear about. Because it's it's still a business, and you have your core group of listeners and people, and so you obviously talk about and discuss the news of the day, but looking for those news stories that maybe the mainstream media wasn't paying attention to that we could bring to light. And I think the biggest example of that was Sean very fearlessly, even though people told him not to, highlighted during the 2008 campaign Bill Ayer's relationship with Barack Obama. And people said he was making it up and that it wasn't true, and Bill Ayers wasn't that bad of a guy, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And he kept hammering it home, and the research and the stuff that it took to do that. So really every day could look different, but most days it was reading, research, reviewing, booking, and, sometimes hopping in and helping call screen too, which is like the best job and the worst job in the world.
Yeah. What's the weirdest call in person that, like, what's something that stands out to you that you're like, this was really weird?
There are tons of those. I think at the time, Sean, there were over 30,000 attempted calls a day.
Oh God.
And that you're a real person, like answering 5 different lines and trying to cull through people
Yeah.
to see who's crazy and who isn't, and who actually has a point that they want to make or debate with him, because he always loved to debate liberals.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are 9/11 truthers, there were Holocaust deniers, there
Oh
were just
gosh.
people that would just literally call in and be like, I'm a liberal, F you,
Yeah.
especially during, I started there in 2004, so it was at the height of the Iraq-Afghanistan war, and lots of people were anti-Bush, and so they'd call in, and if we had anybody from the Bush administration on, then they would call in and be like, you're having a baby killer on, you're a baby killer, and I'm like, interestingly, you're probably pro-abortion, but all right. So I
Wow.
just learned to say, like, Jesus loves you, I don't. Have a nice day.
Oh my goodness. That has to be so intense. Or like, just maybe not intense, draining. I feel like draining would be the word if you're doing that all day.
Some days it was draining. Yeah. Some days I would like get on the subway and be like, I just need to listen to some happy, mid-50s music, or like like and just not think about all of the names I was called. Just to give you guys some perspective, I was homeschooled all 12 years. My parents, in some ways, I felt like I was sheltered, but in other ways, I was allowed to be in like boardrooms with my dad, and go on trips where, he was speaking to troops and executives, because he worked at American Airlines, corporate as a pilot and in the union.
Oh,
So I
wow.
kind of got to see all those perspectives and travel to cities as a kid and be in rooms with people that were, talking the way that we didn't talk. But I was still like protected and innocent in so many ways that I did not know what the awful C word was until I got called it by a liberal that called in to the radio show. And I turned around, and I knew it was a bad word, but I didn't know the severity of it
Yeah.
until I turned around and asked the senior producer, a lovely woman named Rachel at the time. I was like, Rachel, what's blank mean? And she was like,
Oh
and she was
gosh.
like, wait a second, you don't know what that means? And I was like, no. And she was like, oh my God, I can't believe I have to tell you what this means. And then she was like, I'm so sorry you got called that, and it is not okay. and I remember then calling my mom that night and telling her, and she was like, like kind of had the same reaction. And so yes, and when you say it could be draining, it could be draining. But I just had to realize, like, these people don't know me. They don't care about me. And they're trying to hurl personal attacks, but you kind of have to develop thick skin.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in the thick skin. Trust me. So then you eventually made the move to the Daily Wire, where you like you said, you became kind of an on-air personality for sure.
Well, yeah.
How did that whole
actually,
transition go?
yeah. So before that, I made the transition to on air. I'd done some man on the street stuff for Sean, and never really anticipated doing the on air route. After my husband and I left New York, I ran a failed congressional campaign in my home district in Oklahoma, which is too bad because the guy was a really good candidate. Then we kind of did some consulting, and then the man who had hired me as an intern originally for Sean's show gave me a call and said, hey, I'm working on this morning show in LA, and we think we want like a female perspective, and you're like a hardcore Christian conservative, and we think you'd represent a good chunk of the audience. Like, do you want to come audition? And I was like, whoa. I was 5 months pregnant with our oldest at the time, and that show was called The Morning Answer, and it was with a guy you might have heard of named Ben Shapiro and a liberal
Yes.
named Brian Whitman. And so I did that show out here in LA, Morning Drive, for almost 4 years with Brian and Ben. And during that time, I had a part-time job at Truth Revolt, which was one of the first businesses that Jeremy, the God King, and Ben started together. And so I got to know Jeremy a little bit, and a lot of our writers actually at Daily Wire kind of were doing stuff over there at Truth Revolt as well. And then, fast forward a couple years, when they started Daily Wire, there was a conversation of, hey, do you want to be a part of the team and what's happening here? And I was like, absolutely.
So I love that it wasn't just, the story was not, I just had this vision for my life and everything I did was calculated to get to that goal. It sounds like you just kind of went with the flow of opportunities and it took you to where you are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been blessed that it's like our prayer and our motto has always been like, okay, God, if this is supposed to be the door, like, you open the door and you make it abundantly clear, because I'm a very, I'm very risk averse.
Yeah.
Which some people might think is crazy, considering we moved across the country while 6 months pregnant into an apartment sight unseen in Southern California, to take a radio job. But we were kind of at the stage of life where we were like, this is a door and we're going to go for it. And there was no other options and there was no one saying like no. And I think the biggest thing too, we had a pastor once tell us, and it's so true. It's like when you make decisions as a couple, like they have to be an equal decision as a couple. Because now 7 years later, my husband has never said to me like, oh, well, we're here because of you. Or I've never been like, well, we're here because of you. That it's decisions that we've made all along together. And I don't want to say that they've fallen into my lap. I mean, I've worked hard. I've tried to give everything my best, and think I've been a good and loyal employee in a lot of my roles. And but yeah, it's not like I at 12 said, this is what I'm going to do when I grow up. And it's interesting how things have happened.
What kind of advice do you give young people who are starting out in, the career that you're in? Are there just tested truths when it comes to radio, TV, producing, on air that, is just timeless that you hand off to young people?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has helped me is, even though I was raised in southeastern Oklahoma, I don't really have an accent. I know that might sound weird, but I think, and it's something that I can improve upon because I know that I say like and too much. So just working on your speech and working on your dialect and listening to yourself and how you sound. I actually don't like the way that I sound.
Really?
I don't like the sound of my voice. So it is weird to listen to, but learning how to really concisely make your points and understanding that sometimes what you're saying will feel like an eternity, but it can be really brief. And then other times you think that you're making something brief, but it's way too long, and being able to critique your communication in that way. Another thing, a huge thing that I tell people, which is getting harder and harder because of big government regulation, is internships. I swear by internships, because if you think you want to do something, when you're in high school and college, you don't really know what getting up and doing that job every day is going to be like, right? So look for internships or apprenticeship opportunities, or shadowing somebody, or serving as like their assistant for part-time or, minimum wage, to really get your foot in the door and figure out, is this what you want to do? And do they like you? And are you even good at it? I think that those are two of my biggest things. Do
you hire interns? Or is that something, do you have interns that work for you or staff that works for you?
The Daily Wire now has an internship program that I was a huge advocate for a couple of years. I was like, we need interns, because I think it's a great way to it should be a mutually beneficial relationship, right? It's beneficial for that person because they're learning an industry that they think they want to be in. And it's beneficial for us as a company because you're seeing the kind of talent that's out there and really able to determine who you might want to hire or not.
When I got my start, I did an incredible internship, and I had incredible mentors that helped me along. So I completely agree with you 100%. One of the things that I find to be so interesting as a consumer of news, and I'd like to get your perspective on it. It feels like there is definitely a difference between how conservative women are characterized in news or media versus those who are on the left. So here's an example. This is the example that I love. Kellyanne Conway led first woman to ever lead a presidential candidate to a victory for the White House. Mm-hmm. I feel like that should be like, that's a T-shirt. That should be a billboard. That should be like the feminist rally cry of like, oh my gosh, look at this is happening. And that is not how things have played out for her at all with the mainstream feminist movement.
Yeah.
She's a villain. She's the worst.
Well, for leftists, and this is something actually that I talked about in my speeches this week at Michigan State and University of Michigan, if you are only a woman, or you are only pro-woman if you fit the narrative of everything that they say and do. I mean, we've seen this with the Women's March, right? I wrote a piece back in like 2017 about, hey, I would have marched, because at the time we didn't know how conservative Trump was or wasn't going to be. And I was against a lot of the stuff that he was espousing and emulating in his personal life and in his process of picking people, and even the people around him, Steve Bannon. Yeah. And so I wrote this whole thing for the Daily Wire about, like, I would have marched, except these women that claim to be pro-women and pro-feminist aren't accepting us if we are Christian, if we are married, if we are homeschooled, if we are pro-life. And they kind of pick and choose their identity politics, because if you don't fit their narrative of what they think you should be, then you shouldn't be a part of their movement. You're absolutely right. It happens all the time. I mean, it happened. Let's go back. I'm a political geek. We can go back to even Sarah Palin. Feminists for years have been saying that women should have their cake and eat it too. Yet when John McCain tapped Sarah Palin, who was then governor of Alaska and former mayor of Wasilla and a mom of 4, to be his VP, I remember Barbara Walters, like a woman that I looked up to as like, oh wow, like historic female broadcaster. I'd be interested to sit down with her one day.
Yeah.
I remember even people like Barbara Walters poo-pooing Sarah Palin and saying, well, what about her children? She's like abandoning them to run for office, and being like, wait a second, what happened to this women should be able to do whatever men can do thing that you've been touting all of these years? So the double standard goes back a real long way.
What's the fix to it? I mean, I know it's such a simple, probably naive question, right? What's the fix to all this? But everything seems so amped up, so divided, so divisive. I mean, if you were queen for a day and got to really just make decisions that which you would never do, because that's the opposite of any kind of democracy. But what would you, from your perspective, what needs to happen to get things more civil again?
If I were queen for a day and it was a matriarchal dictatorship, I would have, instead of the constitutional government that I personally love, but
of course.
You've given me the scepter and I can make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
I would fly people from the metro New York area, the Bay Area, the LA area to Middle America, and I would fly Middle Americans to those areas, and I would say, sit down and have a beer, sit down and have a cup of coffee. Don't talk about where you're from or what you believe politically. Just talk about you and like develop relationships. Because I think that when you know someone, it's harder to hate them for what they believe politically, right?
Yeah.
When you're like, wait a second, he's a good dad, or she's a good mom, or that neighbor like made me a casserole when my dad died. Like, then they find out that you voted for Trump, or then they find out that you voted for Hillary, and they can't be like, ugh, instantly, because there's an emotional and human connection that you have. I think one of my favorite things is when people see me as so-and-so's mom, and then once they figure out what I do, they're like, oh my God, like, you used to work for Hannity? Oh my God, like, Ben Shapiro? But they can't like hate me because they know me in a different way, right? Like a non-on-air, non-Twitter way. And if they simply Googled me and found what I say on Twitter, they might be turned off by it. But it's a little harder for them to be turned off because they know me on a personal level. And so, yeah, if I were queen for a day, that's what I'd do, is I would just make Americans from different sides of the political aisle get to know each other on a personal level, because we're not all that bad.
It's so hard to pull that off, because now it's like you walk into a room, someone has a red hat on, and
Mm-hmm.
every assumption's already been made. There's no need to even talk to that person to get to know them.
Mm-hmm.
That hat has now told that person everything they need to know, which the majority of that is probably wrong. How do you get discussion going with two sides? So now in the world of reality, there's a lot of people listening out there who they just want to find the middle ground with people. They don't know where to start. You talk to people all over the country. What's the practical things we can do other than getting them on a plane? Like, what would you like to see normal people do to get dialogue going?
I think just be kind to one another and actually be willing to practice what you preach. I think that a lot of people on the right attack the left for, they say they're tolerant, but they're not really tolerant. But it's kind of like, we need to look at the log in our own eye too, because there is on both sides the element of just jumping to judgment and maybe not jumping to that judgment. So if you see somebody that looks like they're transitioning, if you see somebody with a Hillary bumper sticker, if you see a resist, laptop magnet, like whatever, also don't do the same thing that they might do to you because you're wearing a MAGA hat. I think that day in and day out, that's how you can do it, and just always be willing to stand up for what you believe in, but without being a jerk about it.
Do you feel as a parent, do you have a high level of optimism or concern for the future?
Whew. It depends on the day. And in some ways, I think being a parent and being around people that politically disagree with me, becoming parents might make them more, I don't want to say conservative, but maybe more classically liberal in like the Dave Rubin sense of leave me alone, please.
Yeah.
Because I think that you are even in $40,000 a year left-leaning private schools in Los Angeles where celebrities and, millionaires and billionaires that support Bernie Sanders, ironically, are, send their kids. They're like, wait a second, we're still okay with boys and girls. We don't want sex education taught in kindergarten. And those kinds of things give me a hope that, all right, there's still some level-headedness and some unity here. Not everyone is jumping off the crazy train or jumping onto the crazy train like we sometimes think they are based on what we read.
The thing I love about our constitutional system is that states do have can rule their laws differently. I mean, every state can be different, and if you don't like one state, you can move to a different state that's run differently. There's nothing wrong with that. With federal laws that seek to make everything the same no matter what state you live in, I find it to be, I like a nice small government that it can be done in like a closet somewhere. I live in California, so do you. There's so many things in California that drive me and my wife literally bananas that we've had real discussions of, are there other states that maybe have a very different view of education and, where we spend our tax dollars. Maybe we should go live there. What has kept you and maybe other conservatives in California, which is to me is like the representative state of a lot of really left, pretty intense philosophies?
I think that for my husband and I, it's because we feel for now, and we always kind of like check in with each other, like, where else are we supposed to be? Should we be somewhere else? Like, what is driving our decision to be here, and making sure that it's like a God-centered thing and not about us, because you mentioned that earlier. Like, a lot of decisions that we make in life can be about us and selfishness or pride or whatever. We have built and been blessed to have a good church community that's really increased over the last couple of years, and a desire to serve the people in our community. And then also, I think that there's an element of like, there's this edge of doing what we do and being who we are in these types of situations, that it can be like iron sharpening iron, because you are a little more savvy, a little more quick, a little more tough-skinned. I think that can be beneficial. And I think I encourage the Daily Wire to stay, there's always rumors of, will they leave? Will they ever leave? And they ask that on every backstage, like, will you come to my state? Bring the Daily Wire here. And I think, and I always make the argument, see, that's the baby. Oh, no. Sneezing in her sleep.
That's so cute. I love children sleeping. My kids sleeping, it's the best.
That I always say, I feel like we need to stay here because we're like the underground underdog. And I think that even though we're a political company, I think it's good that we're not in the Beltway, because we're kind of outside, I guess you could call it the swamp, and we don't get bogged down with the drama, the gossip mill, and the rumors and the who's who at the cocktail parties. We can kind of be like our own entity and still espouse and emulate our conservative principles, but from a place where there aren't many of us. And I think sometimes you can shine a brighter light, in that darkness, when there's not a whole bunch of voices that are just like yours.
It has been such a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for making time. You are a great mom. You are a great personality, and you give great ideas to the world of political thought. And I enjoy every bit of it. So thank you a ton for making time to be on the show with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I just hit end on the recording. Seriously, I really do appreciate it. I know we've been going back and forth trying to schedule it for a while, and you've been super easygoing, super gracious, and it just speaks so highly of you, and I am very grateful. I'm very, very grateful.
Thanks. Well, I hope that your son is fine.
Yes. Oh my gosh, you have no idea how intense the whole situation was. Like
Oof.
I mean, anything with kids, it's just like, anything with children, it's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And he has special needs. He has autism, so it's like a whole like another level of trying to communicate with us about how it's how he's feeling and what's happening, and it just makes the whole thing just so intense and so difficult. And
well, God bless you guys. We have some friends that they have an autistic, well, they have a Down syndrome baby, and she always says that the Down syndrome parenthood is like the coolest club you never wanted to be a part of. And my cousin has an autistic little boy, and it's they're God's gifts. They're still God's gifts. So but I'm sure it can be a struggle.
Did they know he or she had Down syndrome before they gave birth?
Yeah. They were actually pregnant with twins, and one of the twins died in utero, and so through the process of the testing to figure out why twin 1 died, they found out that twin 2 had Downs, and they were like, abortion was never an option for them.
I obviously, me and my wife feel the exact same way. For those who don't, it grieves my heart, because they are totally a gift, and the parents that get that gift, it's almost like God saying, listen, you can handle this. You're the perfect parents for this kid, for this blessing I have. And it just drives me bananas when I hear the opposite, which is a whole other thing about abortion we didn't get into, and we could have and we didn't. But it's just it's so enriching to hear a story like that. It's so much my story with my wife.
You should read her piece. You should. It's Jean Judge. She wrote it a few months ago, and they were still pregnant with the Federalist, because he was actually born around the same time as our youngest. So he was born in July. So he's almost 4 months now.
Jean Judge.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna Google. I'm gonna Google it. I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure it's stuff that you already know, but I send it to parents I know. It's you're not the only one.
Yeah, it's always encouraging to read that stuff. Well, thank you again. I know you got to go. I appreciate it a ton. Have a really great rest of your day.
Yes. Yeah, and send it to me, and I'll tweet it out and stuff.
I absolutely will. I absolutely will. Thank you.
Sir.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.